When Robert Frost read his inaugural poem in January of 1963, it was the first time that a presidential inauguration had been broadcast on national television. And along with the broadcast of that inauguration came the broadcasting of poetry to the nation. One of the reasons I'm so fascinated in inaugural poetry is not because it's necessarily the best poetry that we get. In fact, if we list all the poets who have ever read at inaugurations, I don't think we'll have a list of the best poets writing in their era. But we have interesting choices that say both a lot about what the American public thinks that poetry is, and also a bit about what each president values in literature. So if we were to watch on television live Robert Frost reading the inaugural poem in 1963, we might think this really is an era of poetry and power, as Frost said in that poem he didn't get to read all of, and expect that every presidential inauguration from now on would feature a prominent poet. Well, if we counted on that, it turned out we would have to wait another 30 years before we got another inaugural poet. JFK did not start a trend, it turned out. And yet, by 1993, 30 years later, a trend is restarted, perhaps, with the inauguration of William Jefferson Clinton. Clinton, surely in a desire to mimic JFK's historic inauguration, asked a prominent poet, this time the poet Maya Angelou, to come and read a poem for his inauguration. Now, Maya Angelou had a pretty different career than Robert Frost. She wasn't known primarily for poetry. Maya Angelou was and is known primarily as a memoirist. Her 1969 memoir, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, is still considered a classic of the genre. And yet, she also was a poet and brought to her inaugural poem definitely a more free verse, late 20th century approach to poetry writing. Her poem was called On the Pulse of Morning, and I want to read to you a little bit of it so you can get a feel of how it's both in the tradition that Frost starts, but also a little different. On the pulse of morning, a rock, a river, a tree, host to species long departed, marked the mastodon, the dinosaur, who left dried tokens of their sojourn here, on our planet floor. Any broad alarm of their hastening doom is lost in the gloom of dust and ages. But today, the rock cries out to us, clearly, forcefully, "Come, you may stand upon my back and face your distant destiny, but seek no haven in my shadow. I will give you no hiding place down here." This is just the first two stanzas of a poem that's about 2.5 pages long. And in it, Maya Angelou is showing us she's writing much more in the modernist tradition of someone like T.S. Eliot than in the American blank verse tradition of someone like Robert Frost. Robert Frost's lines, both of his poem that he ended up reading and the poem that he couldn't read because he couldn't see very well that day, were both in iambic pentameter, that good old 10-syllable ba-da, 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 ba-da rhythm. Whereas Maya Angelou's are short, and also the view of time they take is much more broad. Robert Frost looks back to the founding era, to the Revolutionary War, to the English colonials as his far vision, whereas Maya Angelou puts us back in the time of the mastodon, of the dinosaur. She also has these images that are very elemental: a rock, a river, a tree. I mentioned T.S. Eliot a moment ago, and in fact, she's picking up on the language that T.S. Eliot uses and the imagery in his famous poem of 1922, The Wasteland. Now, The Wasteland is not the kind of poem that you would want to read at an inauguration, given that it's describing a horribly traumatized country and landscape. That's not the kind of attitude that I think you want to give to your American vision if you're at an inauguration. And in fact, there's a reversal of the imagery of the wasteland in the second stanza I just read. Today the rock cries out to us clearly, forcefully, "Come, you may stand upon my back and face your distant destiny, but seek no haven in my shadow. I will give you no hiding place down there." The rock is speaking. This is not just a T.S. Eliot image, this is an Old Testament image. The rock speaking in the desert to Moses, who's leading the people to the promised land through the wilderness. The rock says, don't take shelter under me. You need to keep going. T.S. Eliot in The Wasteland writes, there is shelter, there's haven under the shelter of this rock. Come in under the shelter of this red rock. It's asking the people to come in for shelter, whereas Maya Angelou is saying, no, you need to keep going. And the imagery as the poem moves forward is moving from the rock across the river to the tree, from that which is relatively dead and stale, the rock, through even a baptismal imagery to this imagery of growth and flourishing in the tree. Now, Angelou, you heard a little bit in what I read that there's a little bit of internal rhyme. You have hastening doom is lost in the gloom of dust and ages. Some very basic internal rhyme and some nice alliteration with the D sounds there, doom, dust. And yet, Angelou mostly is writing in free verse. But she gets to a point about halfway through the poem where she breaks out into a much more formal rhyming couplets. There is a true yearning to respond to the singing river and the wise rock. So say the Asian, the Hispanic, the Jew, the African, the Native American, the Sioux, the Catholic, the Muslim, the French, the Greek, the Irish, the rabbi, the priest, the sheik, the gay, the straight, the preacher, the privileged, the homeless, the teacher. They all hear the speaking of the tree. So the first two lines and the last two lines of that stanza I just read don't rhyme. Respond to the singing river and the wise rock. To and rock, they don't rhyme with each other. And then they all hear the speaking of the tree. Those don't rhyme. But in the middle, you get Jew, Sioux, Greek, sheik, preacher, teacher, which become these rhyming couplets, which create this building of energy and give us, for the first time in an inaugural poem, this kind of survey of American types. We call this in poetry a catalog, where we have just a listing of discrete individual people or things. So we get this sense of the broad diversity of America. And this is a trend that we're going to see in many of the later inaugural poems as well. This poem ends on a very positive note, and yet it calls us to action. This poem ends, here on the pulse of this new day, you may have the grace to look up and out and into your sister's eyes and into your brother's face, your country, and very simply, with hope, say, good morning. It's a hopeful end. It's a pretty simple end, and yet it's a call to look into one another's faces. And Angelou has already defined that the one another that we need to look to are the many diverse ethnicities, religions, types of people in America. But also this idea that nature is speaking to us, the rock, the river, the tree, and it's calling us to move from the wasteland into a place of growth and verdure. So Maya Angelou is drawing on the Old Testament, she's drawing on T.S. Eliot, and yet giving us a non-wasteland, maybe even an anti-wasteland. This, I think, is definitely tied to Clinton's rhetoric in the early 90s of wanting to, in his campaign speeches, build a bridge to the 21st century. This idea that it's hope, it's morning in America. Now, it's a little bit ironic that we have this good morning, because actually morning in America is a phrase that we use in an advertisement for Ronald Reagan about a decade before in his campaign ads on television. So she's drawing on, ironically, T.S. Eliot, the Old Testament, and a little bit of Ronald Reagan's rhetoric to promote Clinton's new regime. Now, Clinton decided to follow up when he became elected again in 1996, to follow up the Maya Angelou inaugural reading with a reading of another poet in his inauguration in 1997. This was a poet who was less well known nationally, a poet named Miller Williams. He was a poet from Arkansas, and Clinton was very proud of being from Arkansas, and Williams' poem can sometimes look a little minor in comparison to Angelou's. It's a lot shorter, but I want to give you a taste of it. It's called Of History and Hope. We have memorized America, how it was born, and who we have been and where. In ceremonies and silence we say the words, telling the stories, singing the old songs. We like the places they take us. Mostly we do. The great and all the anonymous dead are there. We know the sound of all the sounds we brought, the rich taste of it on our tongues. But where are we going to be, and why and who? The disenfranchised dead want to know. We mean to be the people we meant to be, to keep on going where we meant to go. This language is a little less monumental than Angelou's. It's a little less elemental in being focused on a natural imagery, on history, but it's making us think a little bit in a Frostian sense of this ambivalent tension that we have as Americans of we want to be who we said we want to be, but are we going to be it? I think of that language that Frost uses of vaguely realizing westward. Do we really want to expand westward? We have this ideology of manifest destiny, but there's a hesitation in the American consciousness in Frost, even though I think ultimately Frost is a bit triumphalist in saying we were meant to spread across America and to make it ours. There's a little more of a worry in Williams' ideas. And yet, after the section I just read, he gets a little more hopeful, and he goes, similar to Angelou, into a more rhyming pattern. But how do we fashion the future? Who can say how, except in the minds of those who will call it now? The children, and how does our garden grow? With waving hands, oh, rarely in a row, and flowering faces and brambles that we can no longer allow. So we have this moving between the how, now, allow rhyme and the grow, row rhyming. Now, Williams, who knew how to write informal verse very well, he had a lot of poems that were in blank verse and used rhymes. He's intentionally not making these lines exactly in iambic pentameter, even though he's flirting with it. And I think that there was this feeling, especially if you're a popular poet in the 90s, that if you were too formal, if you just strictly adhered to traditional poetic forms, you were being stodgy, maybe too Frostian. And so he's allowing his poetry to be a little more loose. And he's calling, similar to what Angelou did, for making sure that we're moving forward, right? We rarely grow in a row. There are brambles in our garden, and yet we can't allow them anymore. There's this hopeful, we got to get past the problems in our past. I want to read the very end of this poem to you. All this in the hands of children, eyes already set on a land we can never visit. It isn't there yet, but looking through our eyes, we can see what our long gift to them may come to be. If we can truly remember, they will not forget. There's this real focus on the children and what we're leaving to the next generation, and calling the adults of the current generation to remember and actually truly be who we say we want to be. I think there's a lot that this poem owes to Langston Hughes. His poem, Let America Be America Again, which is a poem which is a little bit more formal than either Angelou's or Williams, but that talks about this America hasn't yet been America yet. It knows what it could be, and we're going to become it if only we can hold ourselves accountable to it. So Williams and Angelou are continuing in Frost's tradition. They're loosening up the meter, and yet they're still flirting with formality, especially when they're talking about the different types of people, the different generations of people. There's this sense that we need a little bit of rhyme here, but we can't be fully formal. We're going to see in the next video that Obama brings this another age in the 21st century of inaugural poets. And those poets are a little less formal and a little different in how they construe what an inaugural poem would be. But if we want to sum up the Clinton era, I think we can see Clinton is trying to reestablish what JFK tried to establish. and also really point us toward a hopeful future for America. It's not Frost looking back and praising the founding fathers as much as it is saying, you know, we've had some problems in our past, but we're moving forward. Thank you. Next time, we'll look at the 21st century as we continue our series on inaugural poetry.